Well, it's time for us to get back into the work as Terry and I are settled to do the work today. And we're going to be talking about some of our experiences and perspective to growing young disciples. Terry and I both have had the privilege to be part of congregations that needed some focus efforts in this area. And we've got a very simple structure of things to talk about. We'll say that we're really going to cut the time to 30 minutes today. So even if you have questions, which we do definitely want to continue to get, we may punt those to a second conversation in a couple weeks on the same theme, depending how everything shapes out. Because there's a really important subject. I want to introduce two other things that are connected to this. One, we had to reschedule Bobby Blackburn. He will be meeting with us next week to discuss the evangelist and planning for their financial future. And then at the end of the month, the beginning of April, we've got two really important conversations that are connected to this one. Jeff Wilson and Jared Saltz are going to join the dialogue with us. We're talking about the reliability of the scriptures. It's really important, as I see it, for young Christians, particularly because of the changes in the information makeup in America and globally, to have a stronger understanding of the reliability of the Bible that they hold in their hands and how you can understand that for yourself, but also teach others about some of the complicated textual issues there. I will try to do my job, and that is simplify the conversation. But I'll tell you straight that both Jeff and Jared are experts in this area, both academically and personally. They're going to be doing the weight of the conversation. The heaviness of it will be in their lap, and Terry and I will try to ask good questions and try to synthesize and simplify as much as possible. We'll have more about all three of those upcoming episodes as time develops. Terry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Phil, how are you doing today?
Well, as Dave Ramsey says, better than I deserve. It's been a long week and a half or so, or week at this point. Feels like it's been months, but I am really excited to talk about this. It's an important subject, and I think we can really kind of get right at it. So when we're talking about growing young disciples, there's at least two basic categories that I'm kind of thinking about. Young disciples fall into either a new convert, and that's a separate subject. In this sense, we're talking about individuals that you'll have as part of your local congregation's broader family who may be in the age of middle to late middle school, all the way up to the end of college-ish ages, which is around, say, age 13 to 24. I think that's probably a good range for us to think about in this area. Terry, would you agree about that's kind of what we're focusing in on here?
Yeah, so I think the way to describe this is we're talking about young people, quote, raised in the church, second generation plus probably members of the Church of Christ, or that's the way we think of that. So, and there's a lot of reasons why that's important to discuss. I remember several years ago, I was talking with Ed Harrell at a study, and Ed pointed out that all of the major divisions of the church happen, I think he said every third generation, which followed that pattern mentioned in the Old Testament of the generation once removed. It's every third generation. So there's a burden for us to try to solidify the foundation of the future of the church by solidifying young people and growing them not into young people that inherit their faith, but into young people who have their own faith and are actually disciples. And I think one of the things I think you would agree with me about is I think sometimes churches have done a good job of spitting out members of the Church of Christ, but not disciples in that sense. Not young people who actually set their heart to follow Jesus. And that's what we really are wanting to talk about. How do we do that? And so I think that's the best way to focus. Like you said, new converts, which is a different kind of qualification of young disciples. That's probably another discussion that needs to be had, but that's not this discussion.
Yeah. So, for some kind of background perspective, I worked 13 years in a congregation with college kids as a chunk. Terry has at least that many in a congregation that had about that same demographic, if you will, of being near college and being um, in the midst of this. But neither of us are experts. I'm not coming at this as I've got all the answers. I have as many questions as I have suggestions, and that's kind of where I'm coming from on that side of things. There are experiences that we've shared that are similar, but so to kind of put like a little damper on, here's the solution box. There is no solution box per se. There are things that are really important. Um, the
Yeah,
text
let
that
me.
I selected for us to add to that too, comes from Acts chapter 2, and I think there's a good point to it we can make in a second. Terry?
I was just going to say, I'm not an expert. My focus on this started with my very first work, and I'm sure probably yours too. But my very first work was a more rural church that when I showed up, um, the oldest young person was 16, and after him, the next youngest person was, besides me and my wife, were mid 30s to early 40s, and there was this huge gap of, and
Yeah.
it was rare. I would say that less than 10% of the people who grew up there ended up being faithful disciples, but if they were, they went somewhere else, and so there was this huge generation gap that existed there. And so very early on, there became this just awareness that we have to do something about that. There is no perfect solution to this because you and I talked about earlier, every generation is different. And um, you can't, what worked for us 20 years ago with that group of young people will not necessarily work today for the group of young people I'm working with today, for a variety of reasons. But the culture is different. The young people here are different than the young people there. So be very wary of anybody who claims to be an expert because the reality is a lot of this has to be almost specifically engineered to your person you're talking about, which is part of the
Right.
challenge. And so we have a lot of suggestions, but we don't have any qualifications to be experts in that.
I can tell you what hasn't worked too in this area, and they're kind of tied in. In the text of Acts chapter 4, or chapter 2, there, that is verse 32, it reads, "Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and one soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common." And there's a lot of theological edges to that. And I'm not talking about the financial type of things, the money type of things. I'm really focusing in on that one heart and soul concept. That's the bridge that has to be made. You have to create a bridge that allows a 13-year-old and a 74-year-old, an 84-year-old, a 94-year-old to be able to look across the assembly and see a brother as well as maybe a shepherd and a friend. And that's really what you're getting at. Um, and I want to lay the first layer of need on the hearts of the mature in age and in faith. And remember this, and this is kind of a big thing to kind of see that. When someone comes into your context, maybe they come in as a new believer, maybe they come in as a child of one of those Christians that are already part of the local family. You're seeing their present and their future at the same time, not just who they are, but who can they be. Um, Terry and I grew up in a context where we had a pretty much an analog, no digital device available on a regular basis childhood. And if they did exist, they were not very good. You didn't have highly crafted video games. You didn't have any of that. Kids today have had iPads since they were born. iPads that are so much better technology and so more capable. And that brings a lot of challenges to their life, but also a lot of information, good and bad. And so one of the first things that I think is really vital is to create a context where the youngest feel like they're wanted. They have to be kind of drawn in and invited. And that requires people to really kind of shift a perspective. You can do it both literally, but also emotionally and be inviting in that regard. Um, it can be as simple as, and this is something that was done with the leadership of the Jerry Whitson Church. We would specifically at times go to a family and ask them to invite a young believer into their home. A lot of college kids says, you need to have this person over for dinner. Take them out to lunch. Spend a little time with them. Help them feel like they fit. Um, uh, Jerry Whitson had a similar gap issue where a generation was missing from the descendants of the local believers there. And so we had to fix that somehow. But that's really like the first thing I think is really super important.
Yeah, let me, you were
Um,
talking about the way we grew up, Phil. You and I used an actual typewriter at some point in our lives. And the ones we're talking
yeah.
about today have never seen a typewriter, except maybe in a museum. Um, I remember going to the typewriter shop to have my mom's typewriter fixed. That's an experience my kids have never had. So we just different cultures. In the four works that I've been a part of, we've always done what we call mentoring program to accomplish some of this, to bridge this gap we're talking about. And all those programs, if you want more details, you can send me a private message. But they all shared a couple things in common, just really quickly. The young person was invited to choose their mentor in order to kind of make them feel comfortable. They gave us three possible mentors, and then we assigned out of those three to them. Most of the time, it was their first choice. Sometimes it might have been, hey, here's a better choice. Within that program, there's assignments given for them to accomplish together. And the young person reports back to their teacher, usually, or to a deacon. But then we ask that older person to take that young person out to lunch once a week or dinner, take them out to eat not once a week, once a month, to have regular
Mhm.
contact, at least weekly, if not daily, now that you can text. All of that to bridge that gap. Um,
Yeah.
and I will tell you, by the way, it's amazing the people. You would think by giving the young person the ability to choose that they would always choose somebody who's maybe cooler or this or that. And yet the reality is they make some really, really fantastic choices. And sometimes they choose a mentor that nobody would expect. And it is life changing for both of those individuals. Um, so it is
Yeah.
possible to do that. I think sometimes we just need to see the need first and then search for solutions on how to do that.
Yeah. And any of the suggestions Terry and I are talking about from our own experiences are bounded on the reality that it fit our setting and it might fit another setting, but it may not fit yours based on the numbers. Charlene Rice talks about the congregation that she's at, that they have about 30 in attendance right now, and the three small children that are part of that group are the age range, I guess, is like 12 to 40s to 70s. And so you're going to have that. Actually, Charlie, I'll just tell you this, that's pretty average in
Yeah.
the United States now for most churches of Christ, is to have that kind of spreads. Um,
In fact,
and so that
most
requires,
churches are that way. Not just churches of Christ, but
right,
most churches in general are statistically older, and by the way, statistically female. That's another thing to think about. That females outnumber males in most churches. Um,
right.
so you may think that that's a tough spot, but you're actually in the common demographic range for a church in that sense.
Right. And let's address this also in another way, because when Terry and I talk about this too, we might dig into this deeper. But the single most significant indicator for the spiritual well-being of a young adult that is 25 and up is that when we're talking about those who were raised around believers, is that when they were in their home, their family was participants in the church's work.
Yes.
Um, like that's the largest influence. So that means that whatever Terry and I are talking about fits into the niche of the everything else. But the single largest indicator of growing faithful disciples is going to be the home. But we've set that aside for a different conversation. We're talking
Yeah.
about congregational public work right now too. I
Right.
forgot we had mentioned not brought that up. So
Yeah, and just by
this
the way,
inviting has,
the data on that real quick is there was a study, and just want to share this real quick so people know. Parents of the people who walk away from church after they leave home, only 11% when surveyed said that faith was actually exemplified in their home and that Christianity was actually practiced. So
right.
that's astounding. That means 89% of those people who fell away never saw faith active in their home. So if you want to make sure, if you're a parent listening, and to preachers and leadership, understand our ability to influence this is very small because so much of the influence comes from parents. In fact, probably a whole nother episode could be done on, we really want to save young people. What we got to do is teach their parents first and convert them fully. So I said, I point that out to just say, we have to make sure that what little influence we use is used so well that we get the full
Yeah.
potential out of it, because it is so small in comparison to the other factors in their life. So it's an uphill battle we face in that sense.
Yeah, it's a huge, there's a combination of options of how we can make this successful. So be faithful at home and do the best you can in a local congregation context. That's also why there's a connected issue to this aspect of invitation. You've got to invite them to the adults table.
Yes.
There's a term that's used, which is the juvenilization of worship. That's making adult worship like kid worship. That is, in the end, destructive, because you don't want them to stay children, nor do you want the adults to become children. So the worship you want to invite them to is the worship of the grown-up, the adult, the last step. And so we've really got to do a good job of bringing them as soon as we can to being part of the adult context. So preaching and teaching, you've got to preach and teach in an adult way, if you will. Your worship should be in an adult manner. It doesn't mean that you're dealing with subjects in a callous way, but you've got to bring them in to, like, again, that adult table. It's like, oh, you're not the kid table anymore. You're the adult. Bring them in as soon as you can. It will benefit their souls in the long run.
Yeah. And one of the things,
And
by
that
the
really
way,
kind
along
of,
that, let me say this about the juvenilization of all this. One of the things I've noticed that is a trend is that in Bible classes, we think that sometimes things are too hard for young people. And I've actually found that young people want the opposite. I don't know about your experience, but,
oh yeah,
young people want to be stretched and challenged. So when I teach a high school class or even a young adult class, one of the things that's not negotiable is whether you do your lesson or not. I mean, you have to be prepared. And I purposely teach in such a way that you better be prepared or you're going to be left behind in the discussion a little bit. And,
mm-hmm.
The other thing that happens is that we think the key to young people in classes is making the class fun. And that's just not the case. The key to young people in their classes is actually making them educational, making them feel like they've learned something. One of the most requested books for me to teach to high school kids has been for years Revelation. And at the same time, in that same period of time, the adult classes, which, by the way, I teach the same way I teach the high school kids on Revelation, with a few minor changes, the adults almost aren't interested in Revelation because it's too hard for them. And it's just a reflection of those kids that they really want to search out this kind of stuff. They really want to know. So don't coddle young people as a way of trying to retain them. That doesn't work. And that's where the invitation to the adult table really comes in. You need to treat, and I think, Phil, this kind of is built out of this, they're the church of tomorrow concept. I mean, the reality is, if a 13-year-old has obeyed the gospel and they're a disciple, they're the part of the church right now, and we need to act like that, not act like they're not because they're just younger. And that's just a pet peeve of mine along those lines.
Right. They need to be really, once you've invited them to the adult table, their opinion matters. Their needs matter in new, more deeper ways. They should be leading, singing, and leading it from the standpoint that they're leading it, not being told necessarily every single step of how to lead it. They need
Yep.
to be teaching classes as appropriate based on their knowledge. And one of the things that's kind of key to this in part um, is to realize that for high school kids and college kids, having homework out of class is totally normal. It's totally expected. You should be mindful of the time you're asking of them and how much workload you're giving them and how deep that they're required to prepare on the outside edge. But this is normal for them. Like this, it's abnormal to have a class that doesn't require outside study
Yeah.
because they're in a part in their lives where they're learning new things. Now, that doesn't mean that because you ask for homework, that everyone's going to do it and it's going to be great. Because Austin talks about something that's a constant. How do you handle when kids and their parents don't regularly complete their lessons? It's. I'll give my answer in a second. Terry, what's your approach? I'll let you handle. This is a common question. There's no easy answer to it.
So remember how I said that
Uh,
every group of young people is different, and how you handle things changes based upon that. And this question, while there's some things I always do, this question fits in that category. I've been a part. Well, one of the things I always do is I start a class with every high school class is I read the passage from 1 Corinthians 13 that when I was a child I spoke like a child and acted like a child, but now that I've become matured, I'm no longer. I put away those childish things, and I talk about that. Our agreement is there's a difference between acting like a child and acting like somebody who's matured, and as long as they act like they're mature, I will treat them with the respect of somebody who's mature. But if they act like children, then I will treat them like children. And one of the things I specifically tie to that is the preparation for class and doing their lessons. Part of that is, by the way, I can't think of any time I've gone to a parent of a high school student and told the parent their kid didn't do their lesson. A couple of reasons. Number one, more than likely their parents aren't doing their lessons, so they're not going to be any help to me at all in that area. Number two, I just told this kid I would treat them essentially like an adult as long as they acted that way. Even though they don't do their lesson, part of me treating like them adult is going to them directly and saying, you need to do your lesson. I'm disappointed in you. Now, there are times in some classes where it's been so many of them that is a rather public rebuke of all of them. And there have been times where I have actually, for lack of a better term, punished the class to a degree. Maybe it is, all right, since you didn't do this, we're going to read through all of this text together because nobody did this at home. And we're not going to get to have the discussion that I have planned because you didn't make the preparation. We can't have that discussion because you didn't do what you're supposed to do.
yeah.
I will also tell you there have been times where I have responded to them somewhat sarcastically. And from that standpoint, that has to be very careful. You have to have a good relationship with those kids. And I know there's been a time where I did that. I didn't have the right relationship to do that, and it backfired. So I don't really suggest that most times. But the main thing is I treat them directly and talk to them directly. I don't go to their parents because, again, normally that's not going to do anything for them. And if it
Right.
does, it's just shaming them into doing it. It's not getting them to want to. I want to build in them a desire to learn more and to be a part of the discussion. I don't want them to do it out of obligation because their parents are going to ground them if they don't. So
So I try to
that's my
roll
approach.
with praise in public, criticize in private.
Yeah.
So what I mean in that sense is if a kid has been struggling to get their work done, the praise in public might be asking them a question I know they're ready to answer. If they're not getting their work done, the criticism in private is going to be me trying to arrange a conversation that's a small group setting so they're not going to be shamed by their peers. So I can understand, are there things I don't know that's making it difficult for them to be a participant? Um, So it's going to vary that way. And then I try to be creative. With the advent of technology and stuff, and a lot more kids having access to stuff like that, we made text groups where every day I could send out in text, this is what you should be reading today to all the kids, even if it was necessarily for one of the kids. And so that day in their messages, they got the text that they needed to read to be ready for the next class. And they may have gotten that message 5 times that week. My hope is that a conversation would break out in those groups. Um, but that's what I've done in the past, and especially with the college age bracket, they dig that. The high school and middle school groups vary based on kind of what their comfort level is, but trying to be creative to make them want to be there and want to learn. I'll also add this: it's absolutely necessary for the teachers of those classes to be more prepared than the students, and to prepare in such a way that there's a mix of accountability and interest, that like that the kid becomes interested in the subject, and it's exciting and different to the rest of their day because they're having a chance to be part of God's work. Again, that's the adult table type of things. I tend to really prefer offering expository textual classes to those age brackets for the most part, rather than round 12 of how to find a spouse at age 17. To me, I'll tell you that dating to marriage class is kind of like the capstone of your college experience. That's a class you can have a great class at ages 21 to 23. It's not a class for a 15 to 17-year-old. Those are not the same need groups. The 15 to 17-year-old needs something different than that. At least that helps me kind of figure out what should I suggest as a study for this age bracket when you're planning out the big picture of things.
You know, where
And
I've been at the
also
last couple of
involve
times.
them in healthy ways too. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say where I've been at the last couple of times, we've kind of come up with for lack of a term, a 4 to 6 year curriculum that covers just a vast variety of topical and textual studies, more textual than topical. And while there is one dating to marriage class usually in that 6 year period for those middle to high school kids, there's a lot more of evidences, authority, digging into scriptures, a lot more of that kind of approach than always doing. When I was growing up, it was teen issues and Acts over and over and over again. And you've got to completely avoid that cycle. And along that way, by the way, when you do a dating to marriage class, probably not best to have the guy teaching that quite frankly just doesn't really understand them in that arena very well. That's so disconnected from them. And that applies to any of these. Make sure not only are you teaching the right things, which is what you're talking about, but the leadership needs to make sure the right guys are teaching the right things, to be able to make sure it sticks in that sense. And that's a bigger concern sometimes that we overlook as well. I just want to add that in before you go into the next step of activity.
Right. And so I think, we're at the end of our close time here, and 11:30 is when we really want to end this off. So we're going to stop here. In 2 weeks, we're going to pick up. The subject is going to be the same. The outline is going to be the same. We're going to try to dig a little bit deeper into these areas, because the outcome should be, and this is a way to think about it, that the family of Christians that you're part of, that maybe picked up a new convert, maybe picked up a family that had some preteen kids who are now teenagers who are now in college, you're getting extra family members. And when they leave that environment, maybe their job takes them away, you've got an extra son or daughter or mentor or friend or brother who lives in a different community now because you're that invested in one another. You care enough to have them into your home independent of an obligation. You care enough that if you wanted to go to them to get advice or give advice, it's not uncomfortable. It's expected. I'll tell you, it's hard and your heart will be broken at times, but the reward in seeing them flower into wonderful leaders in their congregation and wonderful participants in the work that God is having all of us be part of, is worth every ounce of extra effort and every ounce of your heart that you extend beyond yourself into them and into their potential. Uh, Terry, do you have anything that you need to share with us before we close out for today?
No, um, I think probably the thing to say is that this may be one of the bigger challenges that is overlooked, but is also one of the most rewarding um, parts of the work you can do if you really invest yourself into it. There's not much more um, there's not much in life that's more pleasing than reconnecting with some of those high school students from early on. Maybe it's a phone call or you see them, and and it's certainly rewarding to see them grow in their faith and to watch some of them become preachers. And I'm not old enough for any of them to be elders yet, but deacons, and just to see their activity. I think that's the thing to kind of keep in mind, that it brings a smile to your face, and it tells you that all that effort was certainly worth it, to see their faith grow. And this is a very kingdom approach to things, but especially if you're in a college town like we've been before, Phil, one of the things to keep in mind is you're not necessarily strengthening just the local congregation. You're strengthening the kingdom, because so often those kids come in, you impact them for a little bit of time, then they go back out to wherever their job takes them. Maybe it's back home, maybe it's somewhere else. And so often they take a piece of what you've shared with them, and then they start sharing it with other people. And um, that certainly glorifies God, and that's certainly a motivating factor, I think, that needs to be pointed out.
Yeah, I'll give an anecdotal quotation we can close out. So, um, and also a thank you for all the families and friends who have contacted me over the last week as we've kind of struggled with some grief and sorrow. Met one of the early college kids who were part of the church at Jerry Whitson Road. He had joined in early on, and I was sitting there talking to him with another young guy who's we were talking about, the Bible classes that Michael Travis was starting to teach, and I was about to give my standard quotation, this line of, if you're going to teach a younger kids class, you're basically promoted from the adult class into the kids classes. It is a literal step up in accountability and responsibility. And so you're just going to get promoted. And I was about to give that line, and Michael stopped me and said, no, I get to say it this time. And so he took my line, told it to one of his friends, because he was experiencing that reality, that he had been promoted into the younger kids classes, and they were harder and more challenging and more difficult than he had to prepare for the adult classes. And there's a lot of this that takes place. So next week, though, we're going to have Bobby Blackburn come in and finish out our discussion on the preacher and his finances. And then the following week after that, Terry and I will bring back this discussion to the table and introduce a couple other really important ones as well. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation. We hope that the Lord blesses your work. If you've got questions about this or other things or anything we've mentioned, contact us each individually or directly through the work page, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Take care, everybody.